Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is Harry Miller. He is a veteran of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. He's also a combat veteran of World War II, and he served during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He served a total of 22 years in uniform. And Harry, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's start with the early part of your life, Harry. I know you had a very difficult childhood. Describe that for a bit and where you grew up.
Well, okay, I was born in Columbus, Ohio, at the start of the Depression, and spent my first 10 years involved with that. And my mother died when I was 3. My dad died when I was 12. And I always wanted to be in the Army ever since I was a little kid. And so I got a chance to go in. I went through my line about my age when I was 15.
How successful were you?
Well, it was difficult. The Army had started a program called the Enlisted Reserve Corps. I don't think it lasted very long. But a man told me about it, and he knew I wanted to go in the Army. And so he told me about it, and I went down and checked into it and said, yeah, you can join. I told him I was 18, and I was getting ready for the draft. And he says, yeah, you can join. He says, you have to have a birth certificate. So I went to get a birth certificate. In those days, they had a ledger, and somebody with beautiful handwriting would write the information in there. Well, they couldn't find my birth certificate. So I went back and I told them, I said, they can't find my birth certificate. And he said, well, that's all right, we can let you in anyway. So I went in and took my basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And there was a lieutenant there, I think his name was Miller as well. And he tried to get me to go into OCS after basic training. And I thought, oh boy, that's all I'd need, being 15 years old to get caught. So I had to put him off. And so I put him off, and when the basic training was over, I went to Fort Ord, California, to an amphibious tank battalion. And there they used what they called LVTs, landing craft tracked. That's what they call LVTs. But anyway, I got all my shots to go to the Pacific. And I really thought that I was going to go to the Pacific. I got shots for elephantitis and sleeping sickness, all kinds of things I'd never heard of. Got through the shot line, they called my name and said, you're supposed to go see this man. So I went to see him, and he said, don't unpack, you're going on a trip. So a bunch of us took these LVTs to Europe. Well, you may recall if you know about your history, Eisenhower had a lot of trouble getting General Montgomery, the British general, to get the port of Antwerp. Well, he finally got the town, but he couldn't use the port because the Germans were holding the Walken Island and the South Beveland Island, or it was a peninsula, that one. And so he used these things to send the Canadians in to take the Germans out of there so that they could run ships in and out of the port. Well, after that, they finally opened the port, and by that time, they sent us to what they called repel depots at the time, replacement depots. They had 3 Army camps at Le Havre, France, named for cigarettes: Old Gold, Lucky Strike, and Philip Morris. I went to Old Gold, and from there I was assigned to my unit. My unit was the 740th Tank Battalion, which was a separate tank battalion. And they were at the town of Neufchâteau in Belgium, the town of Neufchâteau, about 15 miles east of Liège, Belgium. Well, the funny part of it was when the battalion got to Europe, they were in a special top secret program called Canal Defense Light, or CDL. This was a real strange setup that they had. The British had planned this thing, and it didn't work too well anywhere except in the desert. And of course, the Desert War was over. So they went to Europe and had to retrain again as a medium tank battalion, which they did. And the colonel got tired of training, so he wanted to go fight. So he finagled a way for the unit to get to Europe, and no tanks were assigned, and even when they got to Neufchâteau. So he reported into the 1st Army headquarters, and they'd shoot him out good because he wasn't supposed to be there. They said, we would send for you if we needed you. So he said, well, we want to fight. So he said, well, they told us, well, you take over the town of Neufchâteau and keep law and order there, and keep training. We'll get you a couple tanks. You can work training schedule out with a couple of tanks, which they did. Well, one night a guy was patrolling the town. The curfew was fairly early, and he saw a lady walking down the road. He says, "Madam, you're supposed to be home after curfew." And she says, "I have to go to the hospital." And he said, "Well," I said, "I'm sorry, but you have to go home." She says, "I have to go to the hospital." She opened it up. She's very pregnant. So he took her to the hospital. Well, later on, fast forward to 1999 when we went over to set up our monument that we put in, this lady stopped me and asked me if this particular guy was there. And I said, "Yeah, I'll get him for you." He said, "I don't know any women in Belgium." I said, "Well, she knows you." So he went over and met her, and come find out the guy that was standing next to her was her son, and she had named him after this guy in our outfit. And then the Battle of the Bulge started on the 16th of December. And the 17th of December, they realized that this was getting serious, so they told us to go to this ordnance depot and take anything we wanted and get ready to go in for the fight. Well, we went to the ordnance depot, and everything that was there was junk. It had been beat up already, had holes in it and everything else. Anything that was usable was pretty much in bad shape. So anyway, we put together 3 tanks, and that's all we could put together from there. So right away they ordered these 3 tanks down to the railroad station at the town of Stoumont, Belgium. And meanwhile, the rest of the battalion was going around searching for other vehicles that we could get for the battalion. So anyway, they went down there was a curved road going down by the train station. And as they came around, we always went around a curve very slow because you didn't know what was around there. So they went around, our first tank saw the lead 1st German tank of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which was Hitler's elite. And they were a mean bunch of guys, they were. Anyway, our first tank fired, and shell ricocheted off the road, went underneath the tank, and hit the soft part of the tank, which is the bottom part, and knocked them out. And then he reloaded, our man reloaded, and the round got stuck, so he motioned for the next tank to come around. The second tank came around, he faced the 2nd German tank. He fired and knocked the muzzle brake off the main gun. Muzzle brake, of course, is out on the end, it keeps the smoke from going straight out, it blows it to the side. Anyway, he hit that tank, and it stopped. They were useless from there on. And then the 3rd tank came around in back of him, and he caught the 3rd tank, and he fired 3 rounds into him and knocked him out. And that was in the first half hour of our unit being in the combat in the Battle of the Bulge, which was quite spectacular. And we got credit for they called us the cork in the bottle, that stopped them. Later on, of course, we had more battle in the town of Stoumont at a sanatorium there called St. Edward's. And we went in there and found, after we got the Germans out of it, we found something like 50 Belgian civilians and children in the basement with a Catholic priest that was keeping them quiet, because the Germans were in the building. They didn't know these people were in the basement. So we liberated them, and oh God, were they thankful. Oh, they were really thankful because they were scared to death. Anyway, we went on to the next town of L'Église and ran the Germans out of there. And from then on, that was with the 30th Infantry Division. We were a separate battalion, and they could attach us to any infantry division. That was with the 30th Division. Well, about that time, at Christmas, the 82nd Airborne came up. 101st went to Bastogne, 82nd came up to our area in the north. And there were 3 thrusts in the Battle of the Bulge. There's north thrust, the central, and the southern thrust. Well, Bastogne sat right here on the tip. We were right here on this northern shoulder. And so anyway, we went with the 82nd Airborne, and then we really had some tough fights. Those guys were fabulous. They were just great guys, and just not only was the unit fabulous, but the guys themselves were just individuals, great. And we were with them through the rest of the Bulge. Then we went across the Siegfried Line. Had a hell of a battle in the Siegfried Line. The 82nd said it was the worst battle they had ever been in. So we had to take their word for it because they've got around a lot. So anyway, we wiped out the area there. Very difficult. Each foot was a fight. Each foot of the area, and we got them cleaned out. That area now is no longer there. It's a mine, a surface mine, whatever they call them. And the town was never rebuilt. They just tore all the rest of it down and left it that way. And then after the Siegfried Line fight, we went into the town of Düren on the west side of the Ruhr River. ROER is where we stopped because the Germans had flooded the Ruhr River. They had ruined the dam up the river, and the water flowed down there, and for a 2-mile stretch, you couldn't get across there because it was so muddy. So we had an artillery duel there, and all we did continually, all day long, pump artillery rounds into it. The Air Force came over and bombed it. But we finally got across the river. The river went down so we could get a bridge in there, and we got into Düren. And the funny thing there was a statue there of Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. And in the old days, he was pointing like this to the west with his arm down here like this. Well, all this bombing and the shelling had actually vibrated this thing so it was completely turned around. This time he was pointing to the east. Well, when I went by that thing, I said, I bet you some GI is going to knock the finger off of that statue. Well, I never knew what happened. In fact, I had forgotten about it. One day, just a few months ago, I was reading a magazine or something, and I saw a picture of this statue. But it was taken from this side. And I noticed that the arm wasn't there either. Somebody knocked the whole arm off of it.
Mr. Miller, let's pause right there. We'll be right back with our conversation with Harry Miller here on Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Thanks for being with us. We're joined in studio today by Harry Miller. He's a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He's also a veteran of both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. Harry, you were talking just a moment ago about the fierce battles for the Siegfried Line and the Ruhr River. Ultimately, your divisions got the upper hand, but explain what it takes to get the upper hand, both in terms of superior firepower as well as the tactical ingenuity that's needed.
Well, at our level, of course, at battalion level, we took orders from the infantry. If they wanted to push, we pushed. And with the 82nd Airborne, it was continually push. And they were great guys, and we were always on the push, continually push. We had a hell of a battle in the town of St. Vith, which was equally as bad as the one at Bastogne, but at least we never got encircled. And we always liked kid at 101st about we never were encircled. We always did the encircling. But anyway, we had a terrible battle there, and I was in the assault gun platoon of our battalion. And we were used for that very thing, knocking down buildings and knocking down church steeples where snipers were. And they would stop the infantry completely. So we'd get into town and they'd say, you see that church over there, there's a sniper up in the belfry, can you knock that off? So we'd get it adjusted, we'd put a round up there and knock the top of the church off, and we'd get the sniper. That was the only way you could get them out. Now, the 1st SS Panzer Division that we faced was a mean division. Now, they had been in Russia, and they were called the Blowtorch Division because everything they saw, they burnt down, and they loved cause fires. They were responsible for the Malmedy Massacre. You might have heard of that. Something like 90-some GIs were captured and shot down in cold blood. The 1st SS had a bad habit of doing that. They'd just go through a town, and if people were just standing there watching them, they'd turn a machine gun on them and shoot them down like dogs. And that's the kind of guys they were. So my particular part of it was shooting these assault guns at the SS. And the SS we never felt sorry for any of them. Now, the Wehrmacht, they were different. They were just draftees like everybody else. But the SS, they were just mean people. And that was kind of the thing that I personally ran into. But it was a continual push. I mean, you never got a chance to sleep unless you were lucky. If your tank stopped, you'd be surprised how everybody would just sit there and all of a sudden like that. And then somebody would have to stay awake to make sure that they can't take any radio messages for us to move. And so it was strictly push, 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 and sleep when you can and if you can. And eating was something else. I mean, you never knew whether you're going to eat or not.
Harry, we forgot something important when we were talking about the Battle of the Bulge. Tell me about the cold.
Oh, gosh, yes. It was very cold. It was the coldest winter that they had ever recorded in Belgium at that time. And it was terribly cold. And a lot of the fellows, especially the 82nd Airborne, when they came up, a lot of them didn't even have winter clothing. They had just come out of Holland, the bridge too far thing. They had just come back from there, and they were refitting in France when they were called up. They got there, and some of them were dressed just like this. They just had a shirt and pants on, and some of them had overcoats, some did not. Some of them didn't even have rifles or weapons, so they had to pick them up where they could get them. But they came in and filled in real well, and it was so cold. I remember one time I counted the number of different coats that I remember seeing at that time, and I had something like 20 military coats that people were wearing, different jackets and coats to keep warm.
Did you have shelter?
No, the only shelter we had was inside of a tank, and when it was moving, we had to keep the hatches open because you couldn't see very well by looking through the periscopes, And if you could keep your hatches open, you could make sure nobody was watching you that was going to shoot at you. And it was dangerous, but it had to be done to keep from being knocked out because the tank was very vulnerable. And our tanks especially, because the Germans had such a good gun on their tanks that we were really sitting ducks for them.
Did your gasoline freeze at any point?
Never had gasoline freeze, I suppose, because we kept the engines running as much as we could. Not only for warmth, but because we had to be on the go. I don't know whether the Germans had that problem or not, but they had diesel engines on their tanks. We didn't get diesels until later on. We captured a Tiger Royal, a Mark VI tank, the only intact Tiger VI that we ever got in Europe, and they brought it back to the States. And that's a separate story by itself. And I wish I had the time to go through that.
Oh, is that still classified?
No, it's not classified, not at all. That CDL thing that I told you about earlier, that was a classified thing for years. And when we had our first reunion about 50 years ago, the guys thought that it was still classified and wouldn't talk about it even at the reunion. And I had to convince them. I said, look, that thing has been a long time unclassified. You can say anything you want to. Well, I don't know.
Harry, let's pause one more time. We'll be right back with more with Harry Miller on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Our guest is Harry Miller, veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Also, he's a veteran of both the Army and the Air Force, and we'll talk about his later service in just a bit. But just prior to the break, Harry, you were teasing us with the story about the Tiger tank, and I don't want to leave our listeners hanging, so please share that.
Well, okay, it was a German Tiger Royal, which is the biggest tank that the Germans had over there at that time. They had one other there was only one or two of those there, but this was the biggest problem that we had there. A buddy of mine was riding down the road in his tank. He was a tank commander, and this was in some fire break in the Ardennes forest. I don't know where it was actually. But he was riding along, and he came face to face with this Tiger Royal. Now, this thing's got an 88 millimeter gun on it, and it can blow a Sherman tank out of it. So anyway, he saw this thing, and nothing happened. He thought, well, maybe the crew is asleep in there. So he fired a star shell above the German tank, and when it lit, well, the Germans bailed out, so I guess they thought it was on fire. So fortunately, he was up in the turret, and he had a 50 caliber machine gun, and he killed 3 of them, wounded 1, and 1 got away. And so he radioed back, and he told the battalion commander, he says, I got this Tiger Royal, and he said, I'm going to drive this thing around here. And the colonel said, no, get out of that thing. He said, some GI will see you and he'll try to knock you out. And he said, no, I'm going to drive this thing all the way to Berlin. He said, no, don't do that. Get out of it. Well, he did it. He stayed in it till he ran out of fuel. So anyway, he radioed back, told the battalion commander where it was located, near the town of Coo, Belgium. I like that name, Coo, C-O-O. And so the battalion commander told him, he says, well, I'm going to have ordnance come up and take this thing and bring it back to Aberdeen for testing, because it's too good of a tank not to. So they went up the next day. The ordnance unit came up. This is where I get mad. First thing they did, they painted their name, 423 Ordnance Evacuation Company, on about that wide on the tank. And they immediately went over and had to try to get the tank loose. Well, it was frozen to the ground because they had steel tracks. So they poured gasoline around the track, got it loose. They brought up a flatbed tank retriever trailer for a Sherman tank and winched this German tank up on it. Well, of course, it stuck out on both sides about like that because their tracks were something like this, and ours were about like that. And so they got it up there, and they hauled it back to Spa, Belgium, to the train station, and gave it to our colonel, and he says, no, I want to send it onto the port so that they can send it back to the States. So there it was, had that marking on there. Our unit actually captured it, but here they had their name on it, see. Well, years passed, and that tank sat at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and one day they decided they were all through testing it and everything, about 30 years later, and they sent it to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And Fort Knox, Kentucky got it, and they cleaned it up, painted it beautifully, looked like it was right off the assembly line. They sawed off half of it so that you could see inside. And they had a plaque sitting in front of it, and it said it was captured by the 423rd Ordnance Evacuation Company. And I saw that, and I about had a fit. So I ran into the office of the curator of the museum, and I told him, I said, you got a mistake out there. I said, that tank was not captured. Number was 332. I've never forgotten tank number 332. I said, 332 was captured by the 740th Tank Battalion. And I gave him the whole story, and I gave him the name of the guy that had captured it. Oh, well, he said, these ordnance people said that they captured it. I said, were you ever in the Army? And he says, no. I said, ordnance never, probably shouldn't say this, but I said, ordnance people never captured anything but a dose of VD at a rear area brothel. And that's actually what I said to him. So he said, well, if you can prove it to me, I'll change it. So I got a hold of the guy that actually captured it. And I asked him to repeat the story so that I'd have it in his voice, and I plugged him in so that he could say it on the telephone, and I could record it. So he did it, and I gave the cassette to the curator there, and he finally changed it. But he had already written an article and gave them credit for it, and the article went all over the world, so it was never corrected.
One of the things people know, if they know history pretty well, is that the Cold War started very soon after the war ended in the European theater, but there's a part of your story that shows just how soon it started. As soon as victory was declared, you were actually sent to Denmark. Explain why.
We were sent to the Baltic to stop the Russians from coming through to take Denmark. We were at the town of well, it's up right on the Baltic. There's a castle there. We stopped there, and that blocked the Russians from taking Denmark. And we didn't know why they had sent us up there for the longest time, and it was just, probably 15 years ago that we found out that we were there to stop the Russians from going over there. Now, while we were there in this town, there's a lake there, and the Russians were on the other side of the lake, we were on the west side. And a couple of guys went over there, and the Russians were pretty nasty to us. But there was some German that begged these two guys to let him hide on the boat that they had rowed over, and they took him back over and set him free. He was very thankful. He wanted to get away from the Russians. But anyway, yes, from then on, we went down to the American occupation zone, and took up our stations for occupation duty. And we were attached to the 3rd Infantry Division at that time. And our people had to crawl up to the guard post because the Russians were taking pot shots at them as they crawled up there. And so that started it for us. And then, of course, it went from there on up. And, of course, you heard about Winston Churchill in 1947 or 8, where he said from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, Iron Curtain has descended. Well, it had descended actually before that, but I like the way he said it. It was sure true. And we had nothing but problems with them continually. And then, of course, I was there when the wall went up, and I was there before that when just the fences were up, but they had minefields on the east side. They were pretty nasty people. And if you got caught over there, you were in real trouble. Thank God I was able to get back over there when the wall came down, too, and that made me very happy to see that it worked. The Germans were very happy about the whole thing. And we have a lot of friends that are Germans now that we never would have had otherwise.
It really is interesting. Young people who don't remember what it was like with the wall have a hard time realizing how big an event that really was.
We had people fly over. They built airplanes and flew over. How they ever got off the ground, we never could figure it out. But they just flew over the fence. That's all they wanted to do to get out of there. And one family took their little car that they had and put a bunch of sheet iron on it and drove through the fence. It made it look like a tank. And they drove through the fence before the wall went up. But after the wall went up, there was a lot of people that were killed trying to get up over it. It was a very sad thing. And I remember one time in Vienna, there was a GI that passed a Russian officers' club. And there was a Russian guard there, and the GI didn't know any better. He said, "Hi, Ruski." And this guy dropped his submachine gun on him. He shot him right there, and he died right there in the gutter. They wouldn't let the MPs or the medics or anybody come over to him until he died. That never hit the newspapers in this country because I asked my sister to watch for it. And she said she never saw it. And that's the kind of stuff, and a lot of this kind of stuff had happened. It would never reach back home. I don't know whether they didn't want the people to know about it. I like to think that was not the reason, but it might have been. I don't know.
Harry, I did promise our listeners that we would get to your service in the other conflicts. So you served in Europe until 1948, at which point you were sent to the Far East, correct?
Yeah, I went to Japan and got there in '48, and I was supposed to go to the 1st Cavalry Division, and they asked me if I would want to go to Macarthur's headquarters. And I thought, oh boy, I won't have to sleep on the ground anymore, and might get some decent meals and have sheets to sleep in. And so I said, yeah, I'd like to go there. So I went to Macarthur's headquarters in Tokyo, Daiichi building, which is still there. And I was in the communication center. I had a portion of the communication center there that I was in charge of. And so they needed to set up a alert, what they called alert crew, in case MacArthur ever wanted to go forward, which we kind of laughed because most people knew that MacArthur never went forward. But anyway, we had to set this up, and I was in charge of it. So meanwhile, we had to go and learn to take off and landing gliders, which we did. And I got my glider pins, and that's a big hit with the 82nd Airborne, the fact that I've got that, because not many have it that weren't in an airborne unit. But anyway, I took the training, and then when the Korean War started, it was some time before MacArthur went over to Korea. But we had to go over a day or two in advance and set up communications, and he would come in and do his thing, and when he'd leave, we'd tear down communications and go back to Japan. Well, they had declared the gliders obsolete right after our training, so we never had to use gliders, thank God. But we had to go in by airplane, and that wasn't too bad. And I never knew where we went because, we would land at an air base in Korea, and we'd set up somewhere wherever they told us to go. And we never really knew where we were except that we were in Korea. People would ask me, what town were you in? What area were you in? I have no idea. I really didn't want to know at that time anyway, because I didn't think a whole lot of that country. I love the people now, and then too I had nothing against them at all. But it was quite different. It was quite a different war altogether.
I read that you tried to go back, though. True?
I went back. I tried to go back later on. I was put into the Army Security Agency, and I wanted out of it. I just wanted out of it. I happened to be in an outfit that was about the sorriest outfit I'd ever been in my life. And I had a lot of personnel problems there, mostly with the officers. The troops didn't have any problems, but I was in charge of the troops, and of course the officers were supposed to set the example, and they didn't set a very good example. So anyway, I wanted out for that reason. So my hitch came up, and I had volunteered to go back to Korea in the tanks. I was too essential, and I volunteered for the infantry. I was too essential. What it was they had so much money put into my security clearances that they just didn't want to turn me loose. I found that out. Anyway, that's the reason I got out of the Army. I went back home, got out of the Army, went to the Air Force, and asked them if they could use me, and they asked me what I did in the Army, and I told them that in my communications work. They said, "We'll take you." And I said, "Yeah, well, let's talk rank." And they said, "What was your rank in the Army?" I said, "Tech sergeant." And they said, "We'll give you tech sergeant, but we can't give you the time and grade." So I said, "I'll take it." And I spent the rest of my years in the Air Force. Best move I ever made.
What were your main duties with the Air Force?
I was at the SAC headquarters, and my duties were codes for the aircraft. Every new mission had to have different codes, because they didn't want a code used going to Vietnam that you also used to alert the force or to launch the force to go to, say, Russia or China or somebody like that, or Cuba or whatever. And so we had to establish new codes for each type of new program that they had. And also I was in on some of the joint targeting stuff for SAC, but my main thing was the codes for the bombers going to Vietnam. And I was mighty glad to see what some of the results were that they did over there, because they did a good job. I've heard a lot of infantrymen saying they loved them the way they did it, because they went in and just tore up a lot of real estate. They changed just a couple of units. They changed over from atomic bomb racks in the airplanes to what we called iron bombs. And boy, when they went over and dropped these iron bombs, I mean, it looked like they were never going to stop coming out. And the GIs on the ground loved that, and I was kind of happy for them that I was able to help somewhat do that. I don't tell them a whole lot about it, because I figure they had it rougher than I did in that war, but I was very proud of it.
Just a minute or so left here, Harry. I've read where you said that even more than 50 years after leaving the military, that you don't regret it for a moment, and that you absolutely loved serving our country. What are you most proud of from your time in uniform?
That's very, very, very true. And I, as a matter of fact, when the Iraq War started, when the Desert Storm, I was walking down the street. I went by an Air Force recruiting office, and I walked in, and I walked up, and I said, "I do." And the guy looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry." He said, "But you're going to have to get a facelift before I can take you." I said, "You dirty." But anyway, I really was serious. I would have gone back in a minute. And I would have stayed in the service longer than I did, but I had two boys, and they were getting of age, so I had to have them back home. I had to be able to be back there with them, because they were just starting to get of an age that I was worried about them. So that's the reason I got out, and I've been involved with the military as much as I could be ever since. I just love the military and the people in it. I think we've got the best.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for your service.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Harry Miller is a veteran of the Army and the Air Force, combat veteran of World War II, and also served during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. 22 years total in uniform. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.